The next session is called Workforce Reintegration, Adults Re-entering the Workforce. Our chair is Mary McMahon, and she is not only our chair in this one, she's putting in the input as well. So she's had multiple roles in this as panellist, chair and inputter. So thanks, Mary. Over to you.
Thanks, Peter. And as I came up here, I did wonder what I've done wrong. Lester and Wendy got the armchairs and the beer yesterday, and I get to chair the session and present the synthesis paper, so I'll have to talk to them in the break. I'd just like to, before I start to present the paper, I'd just like to get you to go for a rummage in your bag and find the blue sheet that says Session 6. And we'll be using the same process for this session as you became familiar with in the sessions yesterday. And I'll give you just a moment to have a look at the questions in Task 1 so that you've got them as a little bit of background while you listen to make your notes. Okay, and what I'm presenting in this session is really a synthesis of the synthesis paper. And I think in beginning what I have to say to you, I just remind you that it wasn't one of the original themes that you were asked to address, but it emerged in a number of the papers that we received, and it was addressed by a number of countries under the original themes of labour supply and employability skills. So while we've called the theme workforce reintegration, some of the programs described were also actually describing the integration of people into the workforce for the first time. So in reporting on this theme, I've had to be selective about the examples I'll give. I'm not saying there are not other good examples in other countries. I've just made a selection for the purpose of this presentation. And it occurred to me as I was synthesising the synthesis and had in mind my presentation from yesterday, that this theme really takes us back to the origins of career development work and its social justice focus. And it seemed to me that in reading the country papers, that career development services are still well and truly connected with those early beginnings. And in fact, for many of the countries who address this theme, the provision of career services to the groups they mentioned was unquestioned. And in several countries, it was a priority above the provision of career development services to other groups. For example, in Latvia, although the Professional Career Counselling State Agency has a mandate to provide services to a broad range of clients, their focus is on school leavers and also the unemployed. And in many countries who address the theme, the career development services described were supported through policy and government funded. The groups that were mentioned under this theme, and there really are no surprises here: migrants and refugees, unemployed people, women re-entering the workforce, people with disabilities and mental illness, Indigenous people, and people with low literacy, numeracy and language skills. And I think that Miho in her talk this morning drew our attention to the issues of a number of those groups as well. Two countries in particular, New Zealand and South Africa, raised the issue about the need for people to have sound literacy, numeracy and language skills in order to be adaptable to changing workforce demands. And that issue, in combination with increased levels of migration within countries from rural to urban areas and between countries, would seem to be an expanding area of need in our field. The Italian paper suggested that the extensive focus on unemployed people, however, should not reduce the focus on other groups and their career development needs. And the groups that they particularly mentioned was that by focusing on these groups, we shouldn't reduce services to employed people and older workers. The goals of career development for these groups that were fairly commonly mentioned in the country papers were, not surprisingly, goals that we've been talking about throughout this symposium. First of all, raising the level of workforce participation. However, there was also a lot of emphasis with these groups naturally on the goals of social inclusion and maximising the potential of these people in the labour market. I suppose in relation to that, the Canada paper reminded us that career development services for these particular groups have been an arena where policy has traditionally always recognised the need for career development services. And it occurred to me as I wrote the synthesis paper and thought of my paper from yesterday that many of these groups have been a focus of our work for over 100 years. And I wondered what we have learned about service provision to these groups, and I also wondered whether we have got it right yet. There was also evidence in the country papers that career services for these groups is largely still based on remedial and reactive approaches rather than proactive and preventive models. And by that I mean that they centre around the immediate employment needs of people rather than preventive strategies or proactive strategies that could ensure the long-term employability of these people. As I read the papers and looked at the examples of services that were provided, I realised that there were some elements or some features that seemed to recur in the programs or the examples that were provided. So I thought it would be helpful to identify those elements and demonstrate them through examples provided in the country papers. And these are the elements or the themes of some of the services. There were programs that addressed skill development. Ease of access was an issue that occurred in a number of papers. Programs that were multifaceted, programs that were collaborative, programs that were customised, and programs that were culturally appropriate. I thought that these were elements that seemed to recur in some of the examples that were given. An example of skill development came from the UK, which has piloted on a small scale a skills coaching program designed to support unemployed adults into education or work. And we know that the coaching area is a growth area in career practice. And that program has been successful to the extent that in the future it will be expanded to assist low-skilled women return to work. And some of the examples overlapped. So in relation to the literacy issue, Norway actually provided training for its language training for its immigrants. So both of those provided examples of ways in which countries are trying to address the issue of skill development for these groups. Ease of access was reflected in a couple of ways. There were a number of examples which illustrated programs that were based in national policy but implemented at local and regional levels, which gave the groups that I mentioned before easier access to the services. And ease of access was specifically cited as an important factor in the success of a program from Ireland called Expanding the Workforce Initiative that proactively encourages women to return to the workforce. Some of the programs, because of the needs of the groups, are diverse, included a range of strategies. So they were multifaceted programs looking at a range of issues involving a range of professional people to try to get the best outcome for the particular person involved. So some of the strategies that formed part of multifaceted programs included health aptitude rehabilitation examinations, expert consultations, work and training tryouts, and practical support in the workplace, such as equipment and adaptation grants and personal interviewer interpreter grants. So some programs actually, when they were dealing with a person, used a number of facets to ensure a good outcome for the person. For example, Latvia described a program designed to assist the unemployed and school leavers become more competitive in their job search that included information sessions about the services available to them, workshops on topics such as job seeking, vocational self-determination, labour legislation and business basics, individual guidance and short-term courses on topics such as computer skills, project management and entrepreneurship. So think from that one example, you can see how a program can be multifaceted to tackle several aspects of the person's needs. Another element of the services was that in some countries there were programs or services that were collaborative and actively involved stakeholders such as government agencies, the individuals themselves and employers. Finland described a vocational rehabilitation service where individuals and officials cooperatively plan solutions related to work or training that take into account the client's health needs. So the client was actually involved in the whole process, engaging what was best for them. And an Australian initiative run by the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations is identifying industries best able to provide job opportunities, and it's developing, with small grant funding, innovative recruitment, employment and retention strategies to increase participation of people with a disability, mature age workers, or mature age job seekers rather, parents and the very long-term unemployed. And that was an example of an initiative that pointed to the need for collaboration between government and other stakeholders. It was also an example, one of the few examples that mentioned retention strategies, which was more proactive than some of the others which are reactive and about just getting person into the job. There was also an arm of this program that was about keeping the person in the job. And some countries, and Ireland was an example of this, provide funding to employers to assist people with disabilities transition into employment. Now, the Australian program that I just described is going to be provided to a range of the groups that I described before. However, New Zealand specifically used the term customised to describe some of their services. And they identified the very specific needs of certain groups, and the two examples that they gave were immigrants to New Zealand and their Maori and Pacific Island population. and they gave examples of how they are providing services to cater for the needs of those particular groups in slightly different ways. In relation to a customised service, their program for their immigrants was particularly noteworthy, I thought. And we heard this morning how important the whole issue of immigration is to New Zealand and their labour market strategy. And they have a program called the New Zealand Settlement Strategy, which is run by the Department of Labour, and the strategy focuses on improving the settlement outcomes, including the labour market outcomes for migrants and refugees. And it recognises and attempts to address such difficulties as a lack of localised knowledge and a lack of recognition of overseas qualifications. And I thought that their point about a lack of localised knowledge was a very important point in relation to the migrant population and the refugee population, because it's okay to identify their skills, but if they can't move in the community and don't know how the community works, they still may not find the employment that they're seeking or the training that they're seeking. The other, I guess, element of services that I identified was where the services are culturally appropriate. And I guess I touched on this in my talk yesterday for us to think about generally in our practice, regardless of who we're working with. This idea of culturally appropriate services, particularly for Indigenous people, came up in the Australian and the New Zealand papers. And the example given was really an example in the New Zealand paper of a customised service, but also a service that focused on cultural appropriateness. And the New Zealand focuses on cultural appropriateness by recognising that the learning and training styles of the Maori and Pacific Island people may not be the same as for other groups, and so it customises services of career guidance within a framework that acknowledges the Maori and Pacific Island cultural beliefs and values. So I thought that those points, those elements, perhaps had some messages in them for us in terms of the nature of the programs provided. As I said, I was going to present a synthesis of the synthesis paper, and so that brings me to the end of my synthesis, which I hope for me and for you has been mercifully short. So thank you for your attention in listening to that, and now we'll move more towards the, I guess, work group end of the session. So this is where your blue sheets come in to play. And we'll be following the same process as yesterday, where you'll have a 30-minute discussion and a 10-minute call to get the most important points down on the chart paper. In the blue sheets, I'd also like to draw your attention to the third page of your blue handout for session 6. And on that page, it draws your attention to Career Guidance, a handbook for policymakers, and a section of that related to policy questions and options. And if you get a chance in your groups, that may be something that you consider. So basically the questions to guide your discussion are: to what extent are the employment services you know of proactive and preventive and focused on employability and sustained employability? To think through those issues about proactive and reactive, or remedial or preventive. And whether it's possible for the public employment services to do both, and to think about the role of the stakeholders in all of that. Is it only a government responsibility? Is it only an individual responsibility? Who should actually get involved in that? The second question, the second question gets you to think about the, I guess, location of economically disadvantaged people and the communities that they're involved in, and think about to what extent career development and public employment services can be equipped to deal not only with the individuals but also with their communities, and to think through whether we need a different kind of service. As I said before, we've been focusing our services on these groups for over 100 years, and are we doing it right? Are there ways we can do it differently? And what do we know about the distinct career development needs of different groups of unemployed adults? And this might lead into some discussion about customisation of services, needs-based services, and the strategic partnerships that may be needed to foster these. So those are summaries, I guess, of the three questions that you've got down, and hopefully you've had a chance to make some notes. Because the questions are fairly long, we're going to give you a break. Tables 1 to 3, if you could start with question 1. Tables 4 to 7, start with question 2. Tables 8 to 11, start with question 3. Go as far as you can on that question. If you never get to go on to another question, don't worry. Just have a good discussion about your particular question and move on if and when you're ready. And all complete task 5, which is getting down on the paper any issues that are particularly important or are unresolved. The rapporteurs will be moving around again during this session, and I'll bob up here again in 30 minutes and give you a time call. And finish off your discussion. And we'll begin our reporting back process. And I'm very, very aware from teaching and training for too many years that I want to remember that any time we run a group process is not long enough, because the topics are so engaging that we could go on forever. So I apologise that we have to cut you short all of the time to get through our program, but I really think that we're developing a rich stock of material as a result of the discussions you have been able to have, and I hope that you continue some of those discussions on important issues to you with your colleagues in the lunch breaks. So, the reporting back task. I also realised that I said I was going to bob up here. Well, I have. If anyone needs a translation of that at lunchtime, it means getting up, standing up. If anyone wants me to explain it in more detail at lunchtime, I will, and I apologise for using an Australian expression.